Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I say all that because the registrants for this session are from all across the globe. So welcome to everyone to this session on Deterring Putin. I am Bob McConnell, the co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. And as this conversation takes place, if you have questions, please use the chat feature. I cannot guarantee we'll get to all the questions, but we will try. Also, I'm obviously coming across in English, but at the bottom of your screen, there is a globe. And if you wish to hear this presentation in Ukrainian, click on the globe and you'll see where you can pick Ukrainian as language and translations will be simultaneous. Our panel for today are all members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network. I will introduce them very briefly, as I believe most of you probably know these panelists. And if I did justice to their resumes, it'd take the entire hour. So the panelists are John Herbst, who along with a long distinguished diplomatic career, was ambassador to Ukraine and is now at the Atlantic Council heading the Eurasia Center. General Phil Breedlove is, well, the primary thing I think to point out here is that he was the Supreme Commander of Allied NATO forces in Europe, and during that stint certainly knew and has followed up on knowing and following things in Ukraine and what Russia is doing. Don Jensen is, he spent time in the Moscow embassy. He has had many different positions, all of which relate in one way or another to the topic today, and is now the head of the Russian portion at the Institute for Peace. Debra Cagan is a little harder to describe because we always just list her as a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, but she was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And the way I best describe her is that when you meet with officials in state or defense or National Security Council, they all know her and they've all worked with her in the past. So she's got quite a resume that cannot be elaborated sufficiently. So I think it's fair to say that the world is well aware of Putin's seizing of Crimea, invasion into Donbass, and other acts of aggression, military and otherwise. But right now, the focus is on his military buildup along Ukraine's border and his demands of the United States and NATO, essentially saying that without our meeting his demands, he will just have to push further into Ukraine. Having said that, John, you're on top of this, not only in Ukraine, Russia, and what's going on in Europe and here in Washington, but Putin has created this crisis. What factors do you think we must keep in mind? And what do you think Putin intends to do if the United States and the allies don't take any further action before the talks scheduled in a few weeks?
Okay. First thing to understand is that Putin has won the war in Ukraine is a Russian operation. The war in Donbass is a Russian operation. And Putin has conducted that war within real limitations. He's tried to keep the Russian hand out of view. He's limited Russian military intervention, but he has led this war. He has supplied the weapons for it. He's provided the officers that run it, and he's provided the weapons. The key fact why we are here today is that this war has failed from Putin's point of view. He thought that Ukraine would, under this pressure, decide to change its foreign policy, and that has not worked. So today he has upped the ante substantially by putting around 100,000 forces on or near Ukraine's borders, and with the prospect of another 75,000, and making statements suggesting he's willing to launch a major open conventional invasion. He's doing this, one, because his covert war has failed, and two, because he's testing to see what the reaction will be in Kyiv, in Washington, and in Brussels. He's hoping by this show of force to intimidate either Ukraine into making concessions, rearranging its foreign policy, rearranging its position in the Minsk talks, or cowing Washington and our European allies into accepting the ultimatum that he sent along with these talks. Ultimatum that include no admission for Ukraine or Georgia or any other country that used to be part of the Soviet Union into NATO, limitations on Western troop and weapons deployments in Europe. Ultimatum that he knows we're not going to say yes to. He is hoping via intimidation, though, to gain some concessions. And at a tactical level, you'd have to say he succeeded. The administration, the Biden administration, responded strongly to this threat by talking about three courses of action. One, to impose major, devastating sanctions on Moscow if it launches a conventional military attack. Two, to provide weapons to Ukraine. And three, to enhance NATO's force posture in the East if Russia goes into Ukraine. But after this laydown of policy, the Biden administration kind of waffled. Under the threat of this Russian invasion, it agreed to talks. At first, the administration put out the line that, well, they wouldn't actually start the talks until the Russians de-escalate. But there's been no clear indication of Russian de-escalation, and now we're talking about dates for those talks. Also, the administration, while it was smart to talk about sending weapons to Ukraine if Russia invades, if it really wants to deter Moscow, the weapons should be sent now, not after the invasion takes place. It's a much more deterrent factor if they have them in place. And the administration has not decided to go there. I hear that there's now some consideration of this within the administration, but they're still considering it. And I'm also told that the range of options is rather narrow. So that is not a positive sign. The weapons should have been sent yesterday, and they should be not just narrow range of weapons, but a full range, including things like not just Stingers, but more sophisticated air defense, anti-ship batteries, coastal radar and such, more drones. Things that would make it much harder for Moscow to invade large without sustaining substantial casualties. And finally, the administration talks about increasing the force posture of NATO in the East, which is a good idea. But why wait until after the invasion, if there's going to be an invasion? Send the troops now, increase the forces now, in direct response to Moscow's increasing its forces on Ukraine's border. We could tell Moscow that the additional troops that we're sending and the additional hardware we're sending to the east of NATO would also be moved once Moscow moves its forces away from Ukraine. We need to see resolve on the part of the administration. We need to make sure that Moscow sees that resolve. If that happens, I think we'll find that Putin is just bluffing. But if Putin smells weakness, the odds of him going into Ukraine with a conventional military force go way up.
Thanks, John. Phil, like John, you not only follow Ukraine and Russia, you focused and worked quite a bit looking at and considering all the ramifications in the entire Black Sea region. What are your thoughts on what's happening and what should be happening?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and got home rather late last night from international travel, so trying to catch up from a holiday. The first thing I'd like to note is that I join everything that Ambassador Herbst said. And I think that the context of what he said is important. And one of the things I would ask him maybe to include or help us to understand is why now? We all see this as a contrived crisis. Why now? Why does Mr. Putin see that he might succeed at this point where he has in the past? And as you know, I try to remain apolitical, and that might be a very political answer, but I think it's important as context to understand why Mr. Putin would attack. But let me offer that rather than talk about that, I'd like to start one other short conversation. And that is, where do we go from here in respect to what Mr. Putin does? I just got back from visiting grandkids, young grandkids. And one of the first things I remembered in dealing with my young grandkids is how you have to deal with bad behavior. And what is absolutely certain to me is that if you reward bad behavior, you're going to get more bad behavior. You're not going to get good behavior. And so I think it's really important to understand in the context of Mr. Putin completely cooking up a crisis, that he has used some bad behavior to try to impose himself, as John eloquently pointed out, on the West. And I believe it's important that we not reward that bad behavior. I am worried because I hear conversations about we're going to tell Ukraine to do this, or NATO's going to do this, and this is the United States speaking. And I need to just remember my time as the SACUR that we don't play poker with someone else's chips. So we shouldn't be playing poker with Ukrainian chips. We shouldn't be playing poker with NATO chips. In these discussions, we should remain in our lane as the United States. If we want to work together with allies and come to a NATO position, then that's important. But what we don't do is make pronouncements for either Ukraine or NATO. I think we need to stay in our lane and demand reciprocity then for the talks, the bilateral talks that we have with Russia, if that's indeed the way these talks are going to go. If the talks are wider and include Ukraine and NATO, then that's a different matter. But if these are bilateral talks, we need to remain in our lane and demand reciprocity for that talk. See, these talks should not come free to Mr. Putin. Demand troop removals, demand a lessening of tensions on that border in order to get those talks. I think we need to keep a focus on accomplishing Minsk and Normandy issues concurrently. We can't allow pressure because of this contrived issue we have to force us into trying to force others to do things that would not be in their best interest. So any movement on Minsk and Normandy should be in cooperation with Ukraine and the other participants at those tables, and that we should focus on concurrent actions rather than non-concurrent actions. And I've been speaking too long, so let me just say, I think the world is watching how we in the West, but more importantly, how we in the United States react to this completely contrived crisis. If the world sees that all you have to do is contrive a crisis to get America to back up, we're in a tough place. We need to stand here. We need to stand and not appease, and we need to stand and not accommodate. And then the world will be set for how they deal with America in the future. Those are my opinions, obviously, not those of anyone I associate with.
Well, Phil, thank you. And when you're talking about the talks, the bilateral talks, it reminds me of a quote from one of our other Friends of Ukraine Network members, Ed Chow. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And, you're talking about the fact that Ukraine and NATO are not at the table as it's currently set. So it's a very significant concern. Deborah, what's your assessment of how Washington is handling things so far, and what should they be doing? We be doing? You're moot.
Deborah's never moot.
There she is.
I think that it is stunning to me how many people are buying into the Putin narrative of how you define the NATO-Russia Founding Act, how you define the follow-on documents, what they actually said. And as someone who actually helped write those back in the 90s, and someone who's aware of what then President Clinton told Yeltsin about this in 1997, I think the people working these issues in the US government would do well to steep themselves in a little bit of history here, because they are misinterpreting what these meant. And I think it is at least a tactical error, if not a strategic one, to suggest that we're willing to talk about Russia's concerns with what NATO does in other NATO nations. In particular, Russia would have you have nothing in Poland, in the Baltics, or in Romania in the Black Sea. They're arm twisting the Bulgarians now about saying we don't want any US or other NATO forces on our territory. And that's not what these founding acts said. And what they said, of course, Russia's upset about this. They've been upset about this for decades, but that doesn't mean we need to reopen this by couching terms like, well, we didn't mean a lot of troops. We just need some troops. We just don't need permanent. We only need temporary. Let me remind the audience that the Russian definition of temporary under the old CFE treaty was something like 80 years, because they wanted to keep their long 87-year agreement with Armenia to keep troops there. And so my conversation with the Russians back in the 90s was, that's fine, we'll buy into your definition of temporary. That means we can put forces on these new NATO nations for 80 plus years. And of course, the Russians' idea of temporary was like 3 days, as we learned in the Balkans when we put some forces into Hungary for deployment reasons. So I think the first thing is the administration needs to make it very clear that we're not reopening any of these documents. This has been solved. And then the key point that I think, going back to what General Breedlove said, is all of these commitments made to Russia, and they're not security guarantees, by the way, they're not even assurances. They were just commitments within the context of those agreements. They don't have real standing under international law, but they were made with one caveat sentence at the end of the whole document, which was, if the security situation stays the same. And the security situation has not stayed the same. It has changed, and it's changed because Russia changed it. And they changed it because Putin sees himself, forgive the analogy, as a shark swimming in a sea of fatty tuna right now. And he sees the West is filled with these fatty tuna. Sorry, I really like sushi, so excuse the analogy. But and that's why he's doing this, because he thinks that even if he isn't going to get all of the ridiculous things he's asking for, he's hoping that the US will agree not to put freedom of navigation operations on a routine basis in the Black Sea. He's hoping that we won't put assets in Constanța in Romania, which he's really objected to. He's hoping we won't permanently move forces into Poland at the new bases that NATO is building there. And so if he can get some of that, that's better than not getting any of it. And I think he believes that the US is more afraid of what he might do, and that will be reason enough to get them to agree to some things that are just absolutely ridiculous. And I'll leave it as there.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the real valuable things, at least for me, probably not for our other panelists here, is Debra brings personal insights into the history, critical history in all of these events. Don, among other things, given your background, I think it's fair to say you're an old Russia hand.
Youthful.
A youthful Russian hand,
Yes.
with an extraordinary series of experiences. What do you think? What's your take on what Putin is doing and what he might do? And I'm going to include right in here that we have a question. Is Putin possibly in trouble with his oligarchs and trying to work his way out through what's going on? Your take.
Thank you. Great to see everybody. Thank you to the foundation for letting me speak. And I want to build on what my three friends, John, Phil, and Deborah have said, much of which I agree with. The answer to your question, Bob, is no. In a way, think about it as it's all Putin's money in one way or the other. So I want to get at this question in a few minutes in a slightly different way, which is to ask how did rumblings and evidence of a Russian military on October 1st balloon so quickly into a major international East-West discussion of European security? I think that is, in many respects, a triumph for Russian diplomacy, at least so far. As you might remember, I think it was December 19th, the Russian government presented us with a list of demands, portraying them as non-negotiable. We all reacted, as John and others have said, on NATO, on East-West security more generally, on Ukraine's autonomy, and so forth. Now, in the last couple of days, it's been very interesting that Lavrov and a few others have indicated there is some wiggle room in the Russian positions, although it is, by my standards, and I think everybody here, still highly unacceptable. So what has begun with troop movements is now a major East-West security crisis, I would say. And I think that needs to, the question is why? And I think what the Russians have done is they're playing what some security thinkers call a kombinatia. You go for one thing, which is to intimidate Ukraine, and you end up getting other objectives more satisfactorily considered as part of the penumbra of what is going on. And I think that's what's going on here. Number one, I think they are still testing the Biden administration. Number two, I think that there, as everybody knows, for years, there have been NATO allies that are less interested in a firm hand toward Putin and the Kremlin's activity than others. And I think this is a chance to push that, to test that, to see where the vulnerabilities are. And number three, I think that, as all of us know, President Zelensky has some not insignificant domestic political issues, which the Russians are trying to exploit, and which the Russians are then making worse by such nonsense as Ukraine thinking about invading Donbass, which is ridiculous. My view is that the Russian demands are most likely an opening bid and not the final form of what they might agree to. The problem is that what they would finally probably agree to is still not going to be acceptable to us. So I highly recommend an article by the Carnegie Moscow head, Dmitry Trenin, earlier this week in Foreign Affairs, which explores this in the context of a really terrible article, terribly biased article, explores some of the nuances of the Russian position. And I think those are worth looking at, both for those of us who follow events, but also those of us who are in the government, to see where this might go. But the bottom line for me remains what it has been for quite a while. Russia will not accept NATO expansion. Russia will not accept Ukraine on the terms of which those of us in the West understand sovereignty. Russia will not accept those. So that means that the dangers are still considerable ahead. What happens if, as I expect, the talks between the US, Russia, and NATO and OSCE and all those other meetings in January and follow-up meetings, what if they hit a deadlock, as I expect that they will? I would guess that Putin will still keep the military pressure up. I think the odds are about 50-50, perhaps higher, that he will still do military action to carry out his objectives. And that is very troubling. And I would emphasize, I think, as John has written here, and John here has written, that I don't necessarily think we should consider only massive tank assaults in Donetsk. There are a lot of more limited military actions that Putin can do to keep the pressure on. And I would close my comments with a caveat, which is to say, and I've said this here, I think, Bob, in the Foundation events before, we cannot see the Russian pressure on Ukraine primarily only in terms of hardware and armament and that kind of thing. This is a fundamental core issue to the Kremlin. They're going to try to undermine Ukraine in whatever ways they can. Energy cutoffs, cyber attacks, disinformation, and all those other things that we talk about here. So when Trennan says Russia seeks to stop NATO's expansion, not to annex more territory, I think that really, to a large extent, mischaracterizes what's at stake. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don. You know, going to several points that have been already made, and I'm not directing this at anyone specifically. We have, you know, this agreement to have these bilateral talks, and I'll focus just on them for a moment. It seems to me that if nothing happens between now and whatever it is, January 10th, the leverage at that table is all with Putin. It seems, you know, the practice in the West has been to wait until he does something to respond. It seems to me he's done enough that there could be some responses now, immediately. And I have some ideas, but what are your ideas, John?
Thanks, Bob. I partly answered this question. I said that we should be sending now, we should have already begun to send military equipment to Ukraine. That increases the deterrent factor. B, it also sends a message to Moscow that we are not being intimidated. And the same is true about, now Phil's the expert since he spent his quality time in Brussels or outside of Brussels. But we should be, through NATO, enhancing the force presence in the East. That would have the same impact as sending weapons to Ukraine now. It would also mean that Putin pays a price now for his intimidation. And then, of course, it'd be a greater price if he actually invades with a large conventional attack. But that's what we should be doing. And again, the administration has, after a good start to dealing with this crisis, has conveyed weakness by agreeing so readily to the talks. And again, first saying, well, maybe the talks only happen after de-escalation starts, but then just dropping that condition altogether. They've drawn some lines in the sand in terms about what will not be acceptable, but the mere fact of these talks is a gain for Putin. By the way, I'm glad Don brought up Dmitry Trennan's article. Trennan is a former Russian intelligence officer who's been at Carnegie now for well over a decade. And he represents, you might say, the liberal edge of the acceptable opinion within Moscow. So he tries to be within the framework of what's okay with the Kremlin. And I think his article is a way to look at how Putin may actually be able to step back from this crisis without invading, even if he does not get the major concessions he's asking for right now. But we can talk about that later if there's interest.
Phil?
Bob, so again, I agree with what has been said. I think that we have to understand there's a bit of a timeline thing here. There are things that we can do which might have immediate effect in getting to them some capabilities which they know they can employ almost immediately and will enhance their ability to raise the price to Mr. Putin if he comes across the line. Then there's a second set of timelines about developing more long-term capabilities for the Ukrainian military. And that's where some of the things you talked about, some of these more intricate air defense and other things would be an issue. Possibility of some aircraft from AMARC and other things like that, but that's a longer term capability. And then sadly, I think we need to have a few conversations with our own Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Much of their industry has capability to turn out very, very capable military equipment, et cetera, and yet some of that is, if not a lot of that, is headed out of country to raise capital as opposed to its military to internally raise its capability. So I think there's three efforts we need to do there, just to recapitalize those short-term things where we can give them capabilities that make them more lethal to an invading opponent. Longer term things that we begin to build capability and capacity in the Ukrainian military in the distance, and then have some of those tough internal talks with them about their own efforts to build for and equip their military. Thank you.
Deborah, a question has been asked in the chat box. Do you think our officials in Washington, and I'll focus on the executive because I think we know pretty much what a substantial number of members of Congress think. Do you think our Washington really understands what is happening and what needs to happen?
I think strategically, the administration has gone about this the wrong way, going back to the decision to extend the START agreement for an additional 5 years. So I'll take it back to the earliest days of the Biden administration, where Russia wanted an extension, no holds barred, for 5 years on the strategic arms agreement. I thought, and I think there were people in the administration, but they were shouted down on this, that based on Russia's cheating on this and its other arms agreements, that a 1-year extension would have been more appropriate, just to test the waters and see if Russia was serious about adhering to the tenets of the agreement, which they have not. So the first thing Putin pocketed was this gift of a 5-year extension of a strategic arms agreement. And no, despite what all the screaming and yelling, nuclear Armageddon would not have happened the next day if this did not occur. The second huge mistake here was the Biden administration signaling very loudly that it was not interested in sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And this has gone into the abyss with the Hill by, having Germans come here and lobbying in concert with the Biden administration to force the removal of these very bipartisan sanctions that some tried to include in the National Defense Authorization Act. I think Putin looks at this as this is the drip, drip, drip of bad decisions that leads Putin to conclude that he has nothing to fear from this administration. And then there were these caveats said, well, there's no way the Russians are going to use this as a weapon. And of course, one only has to go to all parts of Europe and see what's happened with the gas squeeze. I mean, on the upside, US LNG producers are going to be making some money here because they're sending shiploads of the stuff to Europe now to compensate for this. So that was the second issue. So I think Putin's calculations are, I've gotten two huge things from the Americans so far. I've gotten an agreement, as both Ambassador Herbst and General Breedlove have said, to have these talks without preconditions. And it signals something to Putin that, oh, well, we've raised all of these really crazy ideas about you don't get to deploy anything in any NATO country that's anywhere near our neighborhood, anything west of Germany, and anything east of Germany. And you didn't balk at that publicly. You didn't say there was anything wrong with that. So I believe in some ways this Putin perpetuated crisis is a crisis of also our own making, because we didn't put the roadblocks up earlier on this. And I would say, to build on what General Breedlove said, you need preemption. You don't wait and react. You don't say, don't do this or else. You have to put preemption up there up front. It's a little late in the game after more Ukrainians are going to die to say, oh, now we're going to punish you. We know how this turns out historically, and it never ends well.
Thank you, Deborah. Don, I want to bring up something a little bit, it's obviously relevant, at least I think so, that you and I have talked about before. Right now, and it kind of ties into a question that has been put forward by one of our members of the audience. And that the question had to do with whether the Russian soldiers really understand and feel, like they should be giving their lives for what Putin is up to. But in that context, I raised the fact that Russian speakers in Russia, and importantly, Russian speakers in Ukraine have very little access to media other than Russian speaking media. And we, the United States, have one Russian speaking reporter in Ukraine. We're not giving it the evidence we need. We have a vast and important audience that we should be speaking to and telling the truth. Having said that, Don, I know we've talked about it. You've talked to others.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. I can't speak for even the U.S. military, not having been in the military, but served my country in other ways, I hope. I would think what the average soldier thinks does not matter a heck of a lot. I think more importantly, and I say this cautiously because I see Ben Hodges in the audience, what matters more is the fact that Ukrainian soldiers are defending their homeland, and the Russians are invading a country which, according to polls of young people by Levada, they don't really see as an enemy. And so while I expect there would be an initial burst of patriotic fervor, I don't think you're going to see a repeat of what we saw when they snatched Crimea in 2014. On the other question, Bob, you and I have talked about our good friend and colleague, Miroslav Gangadze, being detailed in the last week or so to spend more time on all of this with the VOA Ukrainian service. But I think that, and I was going to hold this till the end, but I'll say it now since you asked. I think we need to spend a lot more time about how we reach the Russian speakers in the occupied territories. I think that U.S. international broadcasting and other U.S. and international agencies can do a much better job of reaching those people with news and information and tell them what's going on, because I'm quite alarmed actually about some of the things I hear from people on the other side of the line of contact, because they're good people and they want their good lives for themselves and their family. But I see a lot of evidence that the Russian narrative is operative not only in places in the West, but very strongly in Donetsk and Lugansk and points surrounding. So I think we need to do a lot more in answering your question. And that begins with probably targeted Russian language programming to those regions, which I don't think exists now in large measure, as you say, Bob, well, other than a couple of reporters who focus on it.
Thank you. Phil, we've talked about questions that we have coming from the audience and that we've talked about in the past, and here is that waiting until Russian action to respond really doesn't seem to be acceptable. It certainly isn't to any of us. But what, in addition, John has brought up and the idea of moving weaponry and capability to Ukraine right now. I vision C-5As landing and offloading things that needed to have been offloaded a long time ago. But are there things that can be done like within a day or two to send a deterrent message? I mean, we've talked about putting capability into Poland that really would make Putin realize something really serious is happening that hasn't happened to date. Your thoughts?
Well, my first answer may not be satisfactory to you, but the first and foremost thing we could do right away is send Mr. Putin a clear statement of solidarity and policy by NATO, by the US, and especially the 5 or 6 big NATO nations. Clear message, do not, or this. We have made some progress on that, but what we don't have is that solid group statement either coming out of NATO or the 5 or 6 big nations that Mr. Putin worries the most about in NATO. And so I think that's something we ought to be working on right now. Make it absolutely unambiguous to him where these nations stand and that there will be consequences, because he's, like always, trying to find the cracks, to live in the cracks, and to divide us and to dilute the message. Secondarily, almost the same thing, except for that it is in the readiness of our troops. If we were to just increase the readiness level of NATO troops, that would be a good thing. Mr. Putin has often said this business on our side of the border is our business, and we can do what we want with exercises and readiness on our side of the border. Okay, let's do that. We can raise the readiness on our side of the border and get NATO focused on, if we have to take action, we need to be more ready for action. And then finally, to the point you really want to get to, and that is, are there things that we should send or other things that we should do? And yes, there's a whole list of things we could do. But before we did anything, for instance, send an AEF into the Black Sea, an air expeditionary force, or send a more naval force into the Black Sea, et cetera, et cetera. I think before we do that, we need to have some pretty tough internal policy consultations with ourselves to a certain degree about, okay, if we go in there and something happens, what are the rules of engagement? What are the standing orders for those troops, so that we don't get in an ugly place and then begin a conversation about how do we respond? We need, if we're going to send forces forward to increase our own readiness in anywhere on the periphery of Russia right now, we need to understand before we put feet on the ground or boats in the water or airplane in the sky, what are our rules of engagement? What are the standing orders, and how do we respond?
Phil, I mean, those are very important points. And I do want to point out, because we hear it every once in a while, Ukraine has never asked for boots on the ground from us. They have asked for assistance so that their boots can carry the fight forward. But I think in this context, when we have Putin doing what he has done, we don't need to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. But like you say, if we can make the decisions, the policy decisions that need to be made, we can put boots nearby in NATO countries and so forth that send our message. John, I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Oh, yes. Again, we have not made any commitment, and I'm not advocating that we make a commitment to send US forces to fight Russian forces in Ukraine. But everyone likes to speak as if Moscow has the clear advantage here because its military is notably stronger than Ukraine's. But in fact, if the West pursues the proper policy, the advantage is all ours. We have overwhelming economic strength vis-a-vis Russia. We have overwhelming conventional military strength vis-a-vis Russia. And if Moscow is concerned first and foremost about NATO, we need to make it clear to Mr. Putin that if he decides to escalate in Ukraine, the force that the United States brings to bear, that NATO brings to bear vis-a-vis Moscow, will increase. And our advantage today will only increase by putting more forces on Russia's borders within NATO countries, which Moscow will not touch. Also, as I've said, to increase Ukraine's already not insignificant ability to defend itself by providing those weapons. And finally, to demonstrate that if in fact Moscow invades with conventional forces in large numbers, there will be punishing economic sanctions. If we make a convincing case that all these things are happening and will happen, the calculus for Putin goes against invading. If we understand this, this will turn out the right way for Ukraine, for Europe, and actually for Russia, because Putin's aggressive foreign policy is not in the interests of the Russian people.
Phil, you raised your hand.
No, I think John covered what I was going to say, so I should have just taken my time.
Don, I think you did also.
No, I did not.
Well, you just, oh, okay, it was just waving.
I was waving, yeah.
Deborah, I think, you know, we have questions here about, you know, one we've talked about a lot among us, that Putin has his own history that he creates out of whole cloth and so forth, and argues that Ukraine is not a nation and people of Ukraine are not anything other than Russians. And he builds this whole narrative about why Ukraine should be his. You're our history expert. I'll ask you to comment on all of that narrative that really, in my view at least, isn't responded to enough from the West to slap down his version of things.
Let me say that I think that question should really go to Don, who really knows this particular background of this region. So I'm going to instead use 1 minute here to just jump on to what both Ambassador Herbst and General Breedlove said, which is this rules of engagement piece is so critically important because we know what happened in the Balkans, where we had sloppy rules of engagement, and what happened at Srebrenica. And I think the first thing that the Biden administration has to do before it has this meeting is have a meeting with all the relevant countries in NATO to have this all worked out, so that when they go to the table with the Russians, they say, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to react. This is what we're going to do. You need to throttle back and move out of here. If you want to create a more unified NATO against what you're doing, start messing with what you think we can do in NATO countries, and just try it, because that's what the reaction is going to be. So I think that's why that rules of engagement piece is so critically important that General Breedlove raised, because I think before the President of the United States sits down and has this discussion, that has to be pre-cooked. But and again, the question, I think Don is the genius on this.
Is that is that a segue to me, Bob? Thank you, Deborah. I think that there's a real problem here, because I think Americans in particular are not particularly sensitive, and very rough in large part, to the role that history and historical narratives play in a lot of these countries in this part of the world. Moreover, in 2014 and 15, I think a lot of people in the so-called foreign policy establishment here knew actually very little about Ukraine. And so you saw a lot of debates about Russian history in that short time, which I think were largely nonsense. And I think that nonsense continues, but 6 or 7 years down the road of this kind of Russian disinformation campaign, a lot of people sort of accept the parameters of which the debate is framed by Moscow. Bob, Deborah, John, how many times have we retched or edited the word separatists from the journalistic narrative? How often have we had to frown at phrases about Ukraine's ethnic and religious and linguistic divide? This has been largely nonsense or exaggerated, but we never seem to systematically push back enough. And I think we really have to, because a lot of people, as I just said, do accept at least part of the Russian narrative about what's going on. This serves as a lever for Moscow to advance its foreign policy interests, and they do it every day. And I think we need to be much more sensitive about it and push back much more vigorously.
Thank you, Don. You know, we've got we have a question or comment asking us if we realize Putin is committing genocide in the occupied regions of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. I'll leave that. The question's longer. We've seen it online. Comments to that. I will add a thought before others speak that, you know, not enough is being said about the prisons that, and I'm using an adjective, secret prisons that Russia has in Donbass, where prisoners of war and others are being tortured, electric shock, everything else, just the same old gulag stuff. It's just not being highlighted that that is the way the Russians are behaving. As to the question about our questioner says about genocide in the occupied regions, does anybody want to comment on that? John? You're mute.
Okay, just unmuted. Look, there's no question that repression has followed Moscow into both Crimea and Donbass. And this repression is very stark against those who believe that these parts of Ukraine are in fact Ukrainian soil. The repression has been stark against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The repression has been stark against people who insist upon speaking Ukrainian and holding their Ukrainian passports. And there have been some eloquent books written by people who have been in those camps, been in those prisons and escaped. And this is something which has not attracted enough attention. And I believe that this is an area where the United States, and for that matter, the West, can do more to bring to light Kremlin crimes. It's also true, and this is a bit of irony, some people, some ethnic Russians, for example, in Crimea, who welcomed Moscow's quote unquote annexation, have found that life is much less freer under Moscow's hand than as part of a Kiev-controlled Ukraine.
John, we have a questioner that really promotes the idea of canceling all visas to the West for anybody from Russia, and what that might do. Is there a place for that in what we do in relation to Putin's aggression?
I think we need a policy which distinguishes between the Russian people and the Putin regime. I already mentioned that I thought that Putin's policy of aggression in Ukraine is also accompanied by a policy of repression within Russia. And so I think that, ceasing to provide visas for any Russian citizen would be a mistake, both from a political as well as from an ethical point of view. But refusing visas to not just, Kremlin officials who are involved in the war against Ukraine, but also their families. Refusing visas not just to oligarchs who support the Putin regime, but their families, sends a very clear message. In a famous scene from Godfather 2, Michael Corleone is explaining why he thought that the Batista regime in Cuba was not going to last long, because a revolutionary blew himself up along with Batista soldier. And Corleone said, our people are businessmen. They're not ideologues. The same is true of the principal people in the Putin regime. They are, with a few exceptions, not ideologues. That's why they keep their assets and they park their families in the West. So sanctions against both the senior officials and their families is an important tool which we have used, but not sufficiently. But I would hold off on stopping visas for Russian citizens per se.
Thank you, John. We're coming to the end of our hour. And so why don't we have, quote unquote, a lightning, you don't have to be lightning quick, but a lightning round of final thoughts. And I'll start with you, General Breedlove.
Time for the United States to lead. It's time for the United States and its Western partners to lead. We can turn this around by seizing the initiative. That's something Ben Hodges is always talking about and asking. We're always in the react mode because of Russia. When do we decide to take the initiative?
Don?
I want, following on what Phil said, I want to stress the criticality, in my view, of those meetings in January and the importance of getting our allies on board a coherent, effective, strong policy. I have my doubts that it will be coherent, but I wanted to flag that in advance of what might happen in early early January.
Deborah?
I'll just say what I said before. I think before any sit down occurs, there has to be a pre-cooked and pre-arranged and agreed to position taken by all allies, not just Germany can go this way, France goes that way, because that's what Putin's counting on. I think we have to go in there and say, as of today, there will be punishing things for anything that you export out of occupied territory. No one in the West will buy it. It'll be boycotted. You can't do any of this. Anything you do in terms of blocking transit in the Black Sea, you will be boycotted. I think all of that has to be, I think, laid down initially. And I agree totally with what General Breedlove said and what Dr. Jensen said here, which is that preemption is key. Don't go in there and say, with your hands wide open, saying, tell us what you want and we can chat about it. That's not the right approach. The right approach is to sit there and say, I'm President Biden and I have concurrence with every single one of my NATO allies and Ukraine for what I'm about to say here today. That's critical.
John?
The smartest thing said during this webinar were by Phil Breedlove on the importance of the United States having a across the government conversation about what we would do when we go in, so we know our rules of engagement for anything we do. And what Deborah just said about the need to do roughly the same thing with the allies. If we do that, and again, if we utilize our great strengths, economic, military, and political, we will have Mr. Putin on his heels, and everything will turn out the right way.
On behalf of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, I thank each of you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts today. I thank the people who have, the considerable number of people who have watched this hour. And you can watch for more from the Friends of Ukraine Network and from the thing. I wish we'd been able to answer every question. There have been quite a few of them. I think we've covered the topics that have been expressed in the various questions. And I would put in a little advertisement. At 12 noon, the foundation has another webinar. It's more uplifting. It's talking about Ukraine's 30 years of independence, unprecedented period of independence since Kievan Rus. And the foundation's now almost 31 years. A little bit of celebration, a great entertainment will end that program. And I urge you all to think about joining it. So with that, good day, goodbye, good evening, whatever it happens to be, where your time zone is, and thank you all.